You will deal with a group that it may seem like it's martial arts, meditation, a diet program, but in reality, look beyond the facade. Look beyond the mask that the leader wears and ask yourself, is this thought reform? Does it break people down, change them, and lock them in according to Schein's construct of coercive persuasion? Because regardless of how they present, that's simply the outer shell. That's the mask. What you want to look at is not what they say, but how they behave.
Mhm.
Not what they claim to believe, but their actual group dynamics, the actual impact of what they do. And groups will present themselves in a way to be appealing, sensational. The leader will grab things from the popular culture, and they create this facade, this mask that entices people, becomes a lure, but that's not really what they're bringing you into. What they're bringing you into is a thought reform environment.
What are the similarities between getting into a cult and getting into a relationship with someone with narcissistic personality disorder?
Well, it comes on fast, and there's a lot of love bombing,
Mhm.
seemingly unconditional love and affection that you're being overwhelmed by to lull you in, to pull you in. And then once you become involved, the situation shifts and changes. So it's kind of like a bait and switch con. What you think you're getting is not what you get. And then, much like a narcissist in a relationship, the cult may try to isolate you. And that varies by degree from group to group, as it would with a narcissistic abusive relationship. So the person that you're involved with is cutting you off or encouraging you to cut off old friends, maybe even family, and you're becoming socially isolated. And that's the way that a narcissist and also a cult will keep you from getting accurate feedback or an outside frame of reference. What they want is for you to be consumed within a social environment that they control, that reinforces their control.
hmm Yeah, that isolation word is tricky, I think, because sometimes we think of isolation as being totally alone, but it can also be an immersion into a cult, or in the case of the narcissist with a relationship and a cult like fan club. Is that kind of how it goes?
Yeah, well, let's just look at the narcissist and a relationship with a person like that. They may say to you, for example, "Hey, let's move to another city."
Mm.
And they're thinking, and I've seen this pattern play out over and over again. And there's a chapter in my book, Cults Inside Out, about narcissistic, controlling, abusive relationships. And I use the NPD profile to explain that number one, this is the kind of person you're probably dealing with most in the overwhelming majority of situations, and also that they're not going to change, and that you have to come to a kind of understanding that if they're not going to change, is this what you really want? And by the way, in the same sense, the cult will not change. The cult leader will not change. And much like the narcissist, and most often, cult leaders are themselves malignant narcissists and very sociopathic, and in some cases, psychopaths. So what you're dealing with is someone who can never be wrong, someone who can never accept constructive criticism, someone who can fly into a rage and go into a meltdown when you question their decision making and critique maybe something that they want to do. And so, in that sense, it's very similar to be in an abusive, controlling relationship with a narcissist to be in a cult. And in fact, when you're in an abusive, controlling relationship, it's this is really like a cult, but there is one leader and one follower. And then if there is a family, there are children, it can be seen as a family cult. And in my book, there's a chapter about family cults, and I use several examples historically of groups like that. So I think what you also see with a relationship with a manipulative narcissist is gaslighting. And you see that in a cult as well, and it's been called mystical manipulation by Robert J. Lifton, who is a psychiatrist that wrote the book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. And in it, in the 22nd chapter, Lifton offers 8 criterion to recognize a thought reform program. And one of them is what he calls mystical manipulation, but what is commonly called gaslighting.
Mhm.
And that is something occurs that you think is spontaneous, but it's really orchestrated and part of a scheme by the person who's manipulating you.
Yeah.
And what you can see in a narcissistic relationship, and also again in a cult, is that the cult or the narcissist are constantly chipping away at your self-esteem. So they're denigrating you in one way or another. They're attacking what you do, what you say, in such a way that what their goal is to make you doubt your own decision making, make you feel less than them, and put them in the position of control. And so a cult does this in a very similar fashion. For example, they may talk about the sin of pride or denigrate independent, autonomous, thinking and decision making. And they attack that because what they want is to engender dependency upon the group and the leader to make value judgments for you.
Mhm. Yeah. And you mentioned that this can work in a one-on-one dynamic. I think people often have the idea that that means to a man with NPD and a woman. In your book, you also cite the example of the DC sniper case, and that's sort of a mentor-mentee relationship. How does that work as well?
Well, Lee Boyd Malvo was dominated by this man that became like his father.
Mhm.
And Malvo had not had a father figure in his life. And so his relationship with this much older man who was a father figure, that became a very controlling relationship. And Malvo was very isolated from his family, from having friendships or meaningful relationships of any kind outside of the relationship he had with his dominant father figure. And and of course, this also became a sexual relationship, as Malvo later revealed. So this was, an example of an abusive, controlling relationship. Probably about 25%, it's estimated, of men have been in abusive, controlling relationships. And that includes gay relationships, heterosexual relationships with women. In fact, I did an intervention to get a young man out of a relationship with a woman who was dominating and controlling his life. And at times, it would even become physically abusive. She would slap him, scratch him, physically abuse him. And so this can happen to men as well as women. But in abusive controlling relationships, it's overwhelmingly uh, men dominating women.
Mhm.
That is very typical.
And what would you say is the goal when someone is luring someone into a relationship like this or into a cult? What is the goal of the abuser?
Power,
Mhm.
sex, money.
Mhm.
So in cults, the first thing is that the leader typically is a malignant narcissist, and they feed on and require adulation, praise, control. It's what pumps their blood. Some would say that maybe even they're hardwired that way. For example, Keith Raniere, who I dealt with for many years, who was the leader of NXIVM, he was abusing and controlling little girls when he was 10 and schoolmates. So this may be something that's in the DNA, and it's been speculated by researchers. that psychopaths may be born, not made. And so, how much is nature, how much is nurture, we really don't know. But I will say this, that once you become involved with someone like that, the formula is that they are seeking power, control, and then, of course, in Raniere's case, sexual exploitation of the women in NXIVM, and then ultimately money. When Raniere was arrested, he had $9 million in his checking account. So he had followers that were very wealthy.
Yeah.
He took them to the cleaners, though the Bronfman, Seagram's heiresses, Claire Bronfman and Sarah Bronfman, her sister, they gave probably over $100 million reportedly to NXIVM and Raniere. They could afford it. Their father was a multi-billionaire, Edgar Bronfman, and they each had an estimated fortune of 500 million. So cult leaders will prey upon individuals to empower themselves, to feed off of that adulation and obedience. And then also they want to control everything around them.
Mhm.
They want to control their environment, control their world. And then they exploit people for money, for free labor, which they make money from, or for sex.
Mhm. And it seems the control too also involves getting maybe the closer inner circle to act as an agent for the cult, or maybe in the case of the narcissistic relationship of making that person into sort of a new source of supply that's going to kind of keep feeding them or bringing them new supplies. Is there a control of the person angle that is clear?
Well, yeah, what you can see is that people are acting against their own best interest
Mhm.
and consistently in the best interest of the leader or the abusive controlling partner. And that's when you can recognize that there's undue influence because they're not acting in their own best interest. And so they're doing things that really hurt them financially, physically. There may be medical neglect, neglect of their children, neglect of their career, their education, because they're repeatedly, again and again, putting the leader or the abusive controlling partner first and deferring to them and doing what is in their best interest. And so they become, in a sense, a pawn or an operative for that individual that controls them or that group. And so they're recruiting other people to bring them in. For example, the actress Allison Mack, who was in Smallville, the series about Superman as a young teenager, as a young man. She gave quite a bit of money to Raniere, but she also recruited other people. And she was constantly used as kind of a poster girl for Raniere, and she would do promotional videos with him and so on. So, yes, the person that's involved is going to use the people that follow him as surrogates to expand his power, to recruit other people, and to garner more and more control.
Mhm. Yeah, and in the case of Allison Mack, to use her celebrity and to be in video opposite her so often. I saw these beautiful videos, really high quality and everything, and it just seems as though he is in some way, if not a peer, superior to this woman who we're used to seeing on television. So you mentioned the pawn as well. There's this idea of the psychology of the pawn in your book. What is that?
Well, basically, that a person becomes an operative, that they're no longer acting in their own best interest. They're fulfilling whatever edicts or orders the leader has given. This is an analogy that was first offered by the psychologist Margaret Singer in her studies. Really to understand the cult phenomenon or abusive controlling relationships, there are certain books that I think really inform the reader that are kind of seminal works. One would be Influence by Robert Cialdini, in which he identifies the six basic principles of influence, which can be used for good or ill. One is a liking, we're more likely to follow and go along with someone we like than someone we don't like. And that's the key to celebrity endorsements. We like the celebrity and therefore we buy the car they promote or the group they want us to give a shot, such as NXIVM. And then another book would be, as I mentioned, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism by Robert J. Lifton. Another would be Cults in Our Midst by Margaret Singer. And then there are two books by Flo Conway and Jim Siegelman that are really seminal books. One is Snapping, which came out in 1978, but first discussed what they called information disease, or a control of information by the group in such a way as to control the thinking processes of individuals. And then the second book that Conway and Siegelman wrote and was published in 82 is Holy Terror, where they examined fundamentalists. But what they uncovered in their study and their research was what they called emotional control. And that is the manipulation of people's emotions to control them through fear, intense intimidation, and basically consigning emotions to the doctrine of the group and causing people to conform their inner feelings to what the leader said was the correct way to feel and the way in which they perceive their feelings, the correct way to perceive them. And so when you read those books, and I'd also add to that Coercive Persuasion by Edgar Schein, who was a professor at MIT. These books really are the bedrock, the foundation of understanding how we can be manipulated, how we can be controlled. And in my book, Cults Inside Out, I have a chapter on cult brainwashing in which I just cite all of this research and show how it fits together and how cult leaders use it.
Mhm. Yes, I'm personally very grateful to you for that chapter because I've done several interviews with experts on narcissistic personality disorder, and they will say the narcissist uses cult tactics. But to actually have it spelled out like that was really useful. And one parallel here, there's the term flying monkeys sometimes around a narcissist, the person who kind of does the narcissist bidding. It seems similar to the pawn. Do you see distinctions, similarities there with that idea?
Yeah, in fact, when I was working with Catherine Oxenberg, whose
Mm.
daughter India Oxenberg was in NXIVM, and Catherine herself had gone to, seminars and intensive training seminars with NXIVM. And when we would talk, and I would talk with other people who had left NXIVM, they would often allude to flying monkeys. And and what they meant was the people that are under the control of the leader, who do the leader's bidding and who attack you and come after you in much the way that the Wicked Witch in The Wizard of Oz sent her flying monkeys out to do her bidding and attack her perceived enemies. And that's where this term comes from, and that's what it means. You feel like the flying monkeys are out to get you.
Mhm.
And it's basically the leader sending out his minions in order to assault you because you have made damaging criticism. And I can tell you that I've had a herd of flying monkeys pursuing me for a good deal of my career over the last 40 years.
Yeah, I bet. There are some outward signs of these people as they seem to be falling into these cultic relationships and things that I'd just love to kind of get your opinion on what the value is or why they come about. Things like hyperactivity, the immersion that we hit on a little bit, a lack of critical thinking. What's causing all this?
Well, hyperactivity is an interesting point because if you keep people really busy and occupy them physically and mentally, they don't have time to think. They don't have time to reflect and think, well, what is really going on here? So hyperactivity can be a form of control. And and basically what you're trying to do is block critical thinking. And that's what you see repeatedly in abusive controlling relationships and in cults. I'll give you an example. In the Unification Church, which has been called the Moonies, which was created by Sun Myung Moon, who died in his 90s a few years back. But he created this big church that has been called a cult. And when people thought critically, the Moonies, as they were called, would look at that person and say, that's stinking thinking. That was their thought terminating cliche or loaded language, as Lifton would say, to stop people from critically thinking. They would look at them and say, "Oh, you're stinking thinking. You shouldn't do that." So in a cult, critical thinking is denigrated. It's a threat to the control of the leader and the control of the group. Likewise, let's say you're in an abusive controlling relationship and you talk to a neighbor or an old friend and they raise a question about this narcissistic individual that you're married to or in a relationship with. And then you go home and you bring this out. You say, "Well, I talked to my friend and she said this, and what do you think?" And then the narcissist is likely to say, "Well, with friends like that, who needs enemies? What a terrible person she is. Why do you associate with her?" And this is because the narcissist sees the critical thinking process as a direct threat to his control. So he will denigrate the friend, dismiss the friend. Well, don't have her over anymore. We don't want her coming around, and so that will be the response. And what it is a direct assault against critical thinking. Because as we critically think and analyze, we might quite literally think our way out of the trap that we're in. Because, in my opinion, people that become involved in abusive controlling relationships or cults have been tricked deceptively to become involved. And then, through the manipulation of their partner or the cult, trapped in the situation. They feel they cannot leave. For example, in a narcissistic relationship, people may have unrealistic fears about what it would mean to leave the relationship. I will never find anyone that will love me like this person. And of course, while they were in the relationship, the person was telling them, "You really aren't worthy of my love. I mean, I love you because I guess I'm just such a loving person, but you really don't deserve it. And I don't know what would happen to you if you didn't have me. Your life would just come apart. You would never be able to find anyone to replace me." And in the same way, the cult creates unreasonable fears. For example, annihilation. They may say, "Well, if you leave the group, you will no longer have this supernatural protection that you have in the group, and you will be destroyed. Or the world will come to an end and you will not be protected. Or you will be damned and lose your salvation, because salvation is predicated on following our leader and his instructions." And so this becomes a trap for people and they feel they can't leave.
Rick, I'm curious about this trapping and some of the things that you mentioned in the age of digital tools. You talked about things like the hyperactivity, turning down the critical thinking. So if we have digital tools, simple things like a group chat, someone who's got a sort of a cultic inclination could start a group chat, and then they can keep people very busy by putting things in there, watch these videos, get back to me, that sort of thing. They can track who's opening it. And then in a group, we know that people's critical thinking does go down. There is a tendency to defer, and that sort of thing. If they have flying monkeys within the group too, those people can chime in and sort of support the leader. What do you think of digital tools in the formation of cults?
Well, I think this is where we're at now.
Yeah.
I mean, in the old days, and I'm old enough to remember those old days when cults recruited face to face. They went to the mall, they went to the college campus, and they pressed the flesh, and they smiled and enticed people to come to meetings and whatever. That's very quaint now. What we have now is online recruitment and retention. So the people are most often now recruited online. They're recruited through social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, now called X, Instagram, TikTok. There's even a cult that's literally called the TikTok cult in Los Angeles that recruits online. And then people are paying the cult through Zelle, through PayPal. And then they can have a special private group on Facebook where they can control the group interaction. And then they can use the video platform YouTube for indoctrinational purposes. And then they're streaming to indoctrinate people and to entice people. And this is the way cults operate today. I mean, I have worked with people that were totally indoctrinated on YouTube. You know, I did an intervention in Ohio, and there was a married couple. The wife was an attorney. The husband was a remote working stay-at-home guy who worked for a Fortune 500 company, but he did his work from a home office. And he was recruited online, indoctrinated through YouTube, and eventually his wife began to notice peculiar behavior, language, a change in his moods, and I was eventually brought in to do an intervention. And he was recruited online by a group called Israelites United in Christ. And I would call it a hate group, in my opinion, that teaches that essentially African Americans are the new Israel chosen by God. And they follow a man by the name of Nathan Ray, who is their absolute leader. And all of this is done through websites, online videos, payments moving online. So this is the wave of not only the future, but this is where we're at now. And I think it's peculiar in the sense that these groups can actually insinuate themselves in a home without parents' knowledge. So minor children can be recruited without parental notification or consent. And there's a very disturbing series that's on Netflix right now called Adolescence, in which they talk about this to some extent, that this 15-year-old boy who kills a girl was influenced online, and his thinking was shaped by the group that influenced him online. And so what we're seeing not only is our cults recruiting online, but we're seeing radicalization of teens. Anyone who has a smartphone can be recruited. And parents have the added burden of maybe monitoring their minor children to make sure they know where they're going online.
Hmm. Yeah. Rick, in your book, you've also talked about gifts a little bit. I've had a man on the show who's actually diagnosed NPD, and he says, beware of narcissists bearing gifts. What is the role of gifts for getting compliance and dependence in these relationships or in cults?
Well, I think in the honeymoon phase of an abusive, controlling relationship, the narcissist is raining praise on you. They may give you flowers, remember your birthday, find a special gift that they think will impress you. And what they're really doing is, you know, lubricating the pathway into their control.
Mhm.
And it's a device because you know, if you look back on an abusive controlling relationship, if you're an individual and you're in a relationship right now and you suspect that it might be an abusive, controlling relationship. Ask yourself this, you know, okay, what was it like in the first few months, and what is my life like now? Am I still getting the gifts? Am I still getting the praise? What's the interaction like now? And what in fact am I getting out of this relationship? Because relationships are give and take. And in the beginning, you may have felt, well, that narcissist gave me all kinds of stuff, was praising me, giving me little gifts, encouraging me. But how is that working for you now? Is it still an exchange between you and the person you're in a relationship with? Or are you just being tapped and giving and giving and giving? And whenever you question them, being battered verbally or even physically.
Hmm.
I mean, and are you happy? I mean, are you sleeping well? How is it working for you? What are your relationships like with people uh, outside of the narcissist? How are you maintaining those friendships? How often do you spend quality time with people outside of the relationship, your family, your old friends? So these are questions that I think people don't really stop and reflect. And usually in a cult or in an abusive, controlling relationship, something shocking happens. This is what I frequently hear. This happened in the cult. This happened in my relationship, and it shocked me. And I stood back and I said, "What's this? What's that?" And it kind of woke me up a little bit because it was so negative. It was so, destructive or harmful to me or to someone else that I witnessed being hurt. And so that kind of woke me up. And then, you have to then retrace the relationship and evaluate how you got to where you're at and ask yourself, where am I going? Where is this going to take me ultimately? Is it really going to be happiness and fulfillment, or am I really just busting my ass for somebody else? I mean, what is really going on? And people, and again, this is where the hyperactivity may come into play, is you're so busy pleasing the narcissist or working for the cult and doing things that you're not taking the quality time to reflect on where you were, where you are, and where you're going.
Mhm. Yeah, and to that reflection too, it also I think can tie back to the gift thing. That seems often a moment when you will the love bombing will sort of reinitiate, or they call it a Hoover. They kind of suck you back in. They'll give you something, or if you comply, if you come back, then they may hit you with gifts as well. So the whole thing can be um, quite dizzying. If you do get to that phase where you are questioning things, we're going to talk about your work with deprogramming. But first, I'd just like to know, some people go through a voluntary deprogramming. How does that affect their recovery?
Well, Brad, look, nobody does involuntary deprogramming
Mm,
anymore.
yeah.
That ended the last time that I did an intervention with an adult that was held by security because their family was worried about them. That was in like around 1990.
Mhm.
So that type of intervention, the old holding people against their will in a deprogramming situation, which was done because the groups would not allow the families access to their own loved one. And so the families chose to do that because they felt that they had no other choice. But having said that, other than minor children, which the parents can hold legally and restrain to do an intervention. Other than minor children, all interventions with cult members or in abusive controlling relationships, which I've done many interventions to bring people out of those type of relationships, that is done on a voluntary basis, which means that it initially may be a surprise, like a drug or alcohol intervention. But once it begins, the person that you're working with is free to go at any time. The only reason they will stay typically is because they care about the people that are in the room. They
Hmm.
care about their family members. They care what they think, how they feel, what their concerns are, and they stay out of respect for them. But they are free to leave at any time. So they may decide, I've heard enough. I don't want to sit here and talk about this, and I'm going to leave. And they leave, and the
Hmm.
intervention ends.
Yeah, maybe what I'm thinking of, I'm not quite up on the terminology, is more of like an exit counseling. It seems some people realize that they need to get out of a cult and then they still want to kind of talk through what has happened. How does that affect recovery?
Well, if a person has already decided to take a break or they've decided to leave the group, but they're really confused and they really haven't sorted out things. They know they needed to leave. They were in pain. They saw things that upset them. People were being hurt, and so they decided to leave. But at the same time, they may feel a sense of guilt, like, how could I leave this person? I'm bad because I left. And the person in the relationship is saying, yeah, you are bad. You're really bad. You should have stayed with me. You have no loyalty. Look at all I've done for you. How can you turn your back on me? And the same with a cult. The person feels, well, I've turned my back on God or the higher power, rather than recognizing that the leader of the group deliberately blurred the separation between them, an individual person, and a higher power. And they indoctrinated people to believe that when you disobey me, you disobey God or Jesus Christ or Buddha or whatever. So you need to sort that out after you leave. You shouldn't feel guilty about having left. You did that for your own survival, for your own well-being, or you did it idealistically because you felt that you were enabling a destructive person or a destructive group by your support and participation. So at that juncture, again, you need to read the literature. You need to review the research and ask yourself, okay, so what is thought reform? What is coercive persuasion? What is coercive control? How do influence techniques play a part in the indoctrination in an abusive controlling relationship or a cult? And as I identify these working parts, do I see a parallel that I can draw between the relationship I was in, the group I was in, the leader I followed, and the research about coercive persuasion and thought reform? And as I often say, if it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, hey, maybe it's a duck. And it's not your fault that you left. It's their fault because they had a very destructive, negative group, and they were manipulating you and using you in an unfair and immoral way.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm so glad we're having this conversation because these phrases, coercive persuasion, thought reform, they don't seem to be as common in the narcissistic relationship space. And I've probably read 10 books on relationships with narcissists now. And it's your work that led me down those paths. So we're going to talk about those in the deprogramming phase. First, just to give people a sense of what the deprogramming intervention really is. There's a metaphor like jumping a car. What's that metaphor?
I think a really good metaphor is the word snapping,
Okay.
and that people come to a point, a juncture where they regain their ability to critically and independently think. So it might be like jumping a car or snapping a sudden awareness. Now, in voluntary interventions and with people that have already left a group and are sorting things out, that can be much more gradual and not this sudden snapping or sudden change, but rather kind of a gradual unfolding of awareness. and or like peeling layers of the control of the group and identifying what they did and how they did it. And so I think that's what that's what an intervention is predicated on. And just so that I can explain one thing that I think is very important is bedrock is what is the definition of a destructive cult? And in my book, there is an entire chapter devoted to this. And what I did, I think, is identify what I would call the nucleus for the definition of a destructive cult. That is that all the definitions I've heard intersect this core. And the core is three core characteristics, which were first identified by Robert J. Lifton in a paper published at Harvard University where he taught, titled Cult Formation. And the first and single most salient feature of a destructive cult is the all-powerful leader. So, number one, there is a charismatic leader who becomes an object of worship, who is the defining element and driving force of the group. Whatever he says is right is right. Whatever he says is wrong is wrong. And he typically has dictatorial power without any meaningful accountability. Number two, that leader knowingly, deliberately manipulates people through thought reform and coercive persuasion to gain undue influence over them. And that can be identified by taking the criteria that I mentioned in thought reform and the psychology of totalism and asking yourself, do these criteria resonate in the way in which the group indoctrinates people? Or they may say educates people. And then the third core characteristic is the leader having obtained undue influence over his or her followers, then uses it to exploit and do harm to them. Now that varies by degree from group to group. So some groups are much more destructive than others. For example, Jim Jones, the leader of the People's Temple in 1978, ordered a mass massacre in which almost 1,000 people died because they ingested cyanide or they were shot trying to run away. And this included over 200 children. So that is the nightmarish example of the worst kind of harm that can be done by a cult. But many cults are in a lower level of abuse and destructive behavior. They're taking advantage of people financially. They're exploiting them for free labor. They're causing them psychological and emotional distress through their pressures and their constant demands. They're isolating them socially, which is hurting their families, their friendships. They're having a negative effect on their education, on their career. So it varies by degree from group to group. But when you see that there is systematic harm being done through coercive persuasion and thought reform, that meets the third criteria. So you look at the group and you ask, does the leader fit this profile? Does the leader use thought reform and coercive persuasion to gain undue influence? And once the leader has that control, does he use it to exploit and do harm to people? And what is the evidence of that? Are there personal injury lawsuits? Are there police reports? Or are there online people in discussion groups on Reddit, wherever, that are talking about this group and this leader having done harm to them?
Mhm.
And by the way, Brad, this is why I created the Cult Education Institute database in 1996, which is a huge database with information about hundreds and hundreds of groups and leaders, including a section on abusive controlling relationships, educational videos, all free to the public and online at culteducation.com.
Great. We'll put a link to that in the description for people to check out. And so to give people kind of a scaffolding of what we're talking about, so we've kind of hit the first of your four big elements of a deprogramming. The deprogramming is metaphorically, it's jump starting a car. It's getting the critical thinking going. That seems to be the thing that one of the major things that cults really attack, narcissistic relationships really attack, is someone's ability to think critically. So we get them thinking critically. We have this information presentation. The first is those elements of the cult that you talked about. Um, the next one that we could probably talk about all day is gaining undue influence or thought reform. Um, Maybe we could start with, is it Edgar Schein?
Yes.
Schein. His maybe is the simplest to kind of get your head around. It's just three elements: unfreezing, changing, and refreezing. What is that? How does that work?
Okay, so there are four blocks of discussion
Mhm.
in an intervention. The first block you've discussed, which is defining a destructive cult. The second is explaining coercive persuasion and thought reform so that the that you're working with in the intervention understands how that is done. And Schein identified the three stages of coercive persuasion, as you point out, as unfreezing, or what I would call breaking people down. And then second, changing, which is the manipulation to change their way of thinking, their worldview, to conform to the leader and to empower the leader. And then finally, the refreezing, or what I would call locking in the change, locking it down. And what that means is you create that kind of social environment of constant reinforcement from other group members, or you isolate them from criticism or independent uh, thinkers that are outside of the group that might offer another perspective. You want to, create a kind of bubble where they inhabit an echo chamber that you control. To the extent that you control information, you control what people read, what they see, who they talk to, what they hear. You can control the mind by controlling what goes into the mind. You can control the mind itself. So that is how you lock it down, is through that control. Now, what I find is that the more intense the demands of the group, the more extreme these levers of control will be. So, for example, in a group that is not making extreme demands, there may be less social isolation. But when the leader is saying, no one in this group can have sex except me and whoever I choose for the day or the hour. Men, you have to abandon your wives, and your wives are mine if I want them. I mean, that was what went on inside the Waco Davidian compound under the control of David Koresh in Texas in the late 80s, early 90s, before the notorious Waco Davidian standoff where the BATF raided the compound and there was a horrible gun battle. People died. Then the FBI encircled the compound and there was a 51-day standoff until I believe, and I think the evidence supports, that David Koresh ordered a fire to be set in the compound. They found accelerant traces, and he burned the place down rather than surrender. And 90 people died, including, many children. And so Koresh controlled the environment intensely. He did not allow people to leave the compound in the months leading up to the standoff unless they were supervised and he knew exactly where they were, who they were with, and so on. And in that compound, the only way that families could communicate with loved ones, and I dealt with many families and actually did interventions to get people out of the Waco Davidians successfully. There was only one phone in the compound, and David Koresh controlled it. And then there was a mobile phone, which he also controlled. And if families wanted to visit with a family member, they had to come, like it was almost like a prison, and they would go to a visitation area. They would be watched. Phone conversations would be listened to. And so this was the kind of extreme control that David Koresh had that facilitated the kind of demands that he would make of his members. Because typically, if someone says, I want you to give up your wife and I'll have sex with her whenever I want, most people would say, you're crazy. I'm not going to do that. That's not going to happen. Well, he gradually moved people to this place where they would submit, and he created a controlled environment where, as he moved them and chipped away at their critical thinking, they could get no outside support. They could get no alternative feedback from another person, from a family member, from an old friend, because he was controlling all that communication. And so that's what you see with a very extreme destructive cult is the more intense the demands of the leader, the more the leader feels a need to control communication, social interaction, and all of that.
Mhm. Yeah. So we have this Schein's model, this three-part model, to look at something with just another layer, four layers. Pronunciation, I'm struggling. Ofshe?
Ofshe. Ofshe was really very much a mover and shaker in the 80s
Yeah.
and maybe the early 90s. And I really like that paper he wrote, uh, uh, Coercive Persuasion and Attitude Change. And what Ofshe did was he would use Schein and he would use Lifton, and then he would, explain each of those criteria or stages.
What are his four key factors of coercive persuasion? I think for some people, coercive persuasion, you can kind of get what the idea means just from the words, but I don't hear it used as much. Number
Okay.
one is reliance on intense interpersonal and psychological attack to destabilize an individual.
Yeah. Yeah. So what happens in an abusive controlling relationship or a cult is you're being constantly criticized, and that's breaking you down. Now, you may already have vulnerabilities. You may have issues about your past, about your family, about your life, and those become the cracks that the group can then leverage. I'll give you an example. In Synanon, which was a drug rehabilitation community and a cult in California, started by Charles Diedrich, they had what they called the hot seat, which was they would put a chair in the middle of a circle of people in chairs, and that person was on the hot seat. And then all the people in the circle would criticize that person and basically attack them. And it's also been called attack therapy. And so what you're doing in that process is you're breaking them down. And of course, you're also encouraging what Lifton called the cult of confession. And that is unreasonable demands for arbitrary confession, no matter how hurtful, no matter how painful, and no boundaries. There are no boundaries. You can solicit confession over anything, anyone. And of course, this is also happening in the unfreezing stage. And the group is gathering information on individuals in such a way that they know all your weaknesses, and they can exploit them. So they solicit confession, and then they use that confession for their own purposes. Another example would be the Church of Scientology. Scientology has a practice called auditing, in which people sit across the table from a person who is an auditor. And I would liken that person to a confessor. But here's the twist: they use an apparatus that they call an e-meter, in which the person who's being audited holds two metal cans and it affects a box with a needle. And when the needle moves, Scientology says, "Oh, we need to work on you. Your needle is not floating. It should just float." But what you're really connected to is a piece of a polygraph. In other words, a galvanic response measuring apparatus. So what it's really measuring is your nervousness. And so as you're being, audited, as you're confessing everything, the auditor is saying, well, how's your family life going? How's your work going? How are your relationships going? And he has or she has the advantage of looking at the needle on the e-meter. And they can tell when you're nervous about a question they ask, and then they can drill down into that particular area and solicit more confession. So this is an example of what I would see as the cult of confession in Scientology. And this is part of the breaking people down process. And let me just add to this and say that many people, when they enter into a cult or an abusive, controlling relationship, are already having a difficult time in their life. This is a consistent narrative, a thread that I pull through many of my cases that I work and situations that I become aware of, is that a person was going through a difficult time in their life, and then along comes this wonderful person, this narcissist, who seems like a knight in shining armor, and you are more likely to be beguiled by this person because you're going through a tough time in your life. And the same thing is true of people who join cults. Somebody approaches them, could be a coworker, a relative, an old friend, a romantic interest, and they say, "Hey, let's go to this seminar together. It's called NXIVM, and it'll make you a better person and help you realize your potential." And they're not really telling you much. And you, on the basis of trust, go along with them, you get involved, and that leads you into a cult. And maybe at that time, you were not feeling really good about your life. Things weren't going well. For example, the man that I talked about that worked for a Fortune 500 company remotely from a home office and was indoctrinated into a horrible, extreme group, a hate group, in my opinion. He had lost a very close friend. He was in his 30s and his friend was in his 30s, and he dropped dead from a massive heart attack. And it was devastating to this man. I mean, this was his closest friend. He loved him. He was deeply affected and very sad by this loss. And at that point, he became aware of the IUIC, the group. And let me just also add another thing to this, which is that the algorithms of YouTube and other sites on the web are going to push more information at you based on your inquiries. So if you stumble across this group and then you click on some of their stuff, YouTube is going to start serving up more of it. And that makes it easier for you to, as they say, go down the rabbit hole. So this is part of the insidiousness of being online, is how that can pull you into something destructive.
Yeah. And Rick, we're seeing these different models and they overlap a lot. One thing I think is a general theme is that people just have a hard time understanding how a person can get pulled into this. You talked a lot about NXIVM, and I think Sarah Edmondson at one point in the documentary, The Vow on HBO, she says something like that how people got pulled in and got so far was kind of left on the cutting room floor when they first did the New York Times article. Um, so maybe we could go into the distinction between education versus real thought reform. And if it's all right with you, I'll pull up Singer's chart on that, and we can kind of talk through it because she has this wonderful chart that distinguishes between the two.
Yes, and I put that with attribution in my book. Education, what Singer does is she shows the difference between various forms of persuasion. So the least coercive would be education, and then comes advertising, and then comes propaganda, and then comes indoctrination, and then comes thought reform. And you can see the differences by the way in which Singer makes distinctions on the chart. Now, in education, there's not a deliberate deception. You go to a school, you go to a college, you sign up for a course, you read the syllabus, the teacher teaches the course that you signed up for, and it's accredited, and the teacher is accountable for certain educational standards and such. And then in the class, you can question the teacher. There can be a rebuttal, there can be a critique, there can be an ongoing dialogue about what is being presented. In advertising, it's more one-sided. And of course, they're trying to sell you a product. But there is such a thing as truth in advertising, and advertisers can be held liable if they misrepresent a product and deliberately distort what it may do for you or its properties. And then in propaganda, we see this in politics. One side is attacking the other. They have an agenda. They want you to vote for Mr. X as opposed to Ms. Y, and they denigrate the opposing politician and their policies. And it is one-sided, but there's an acknowledgement that it is one-sided and that they are promoting a particular political ideology and that it is propaganda. And then in indoctrination, we typically sign up for indoctrination. So, for example, you go to a Catholic parochial school, and with the understanding that they will indoctrinate you to be a Roman Catholic, or you're Jewish and you go to Hebrew school, and you understand that the purpose of the school is to inculcate the values of the Torah, the Talmud, and to be a good Jew. So indoctrination is with knowing consent. Another example would be someone agreeing to become a Buddhist monk or a Jesuit priest. It would be rigorous. They would give up things. They might take a vow of silence. They would be celibate. But this would be done with their consent because they knew that these were the kind of sacrifices that they would have to make, and indoctrination is willingly agreed upon, and the person is indoctrinated. Now you could also point out that children are indoctrinated at religious schools and such, and that's the prerogative of their parents who choose to raise them in a particular religion or to go to a particular type of school, like a Montessori school or whatever. And so that would be decided upon by their parents, but again, with their informed consent. And then finally, you have thought reform, which is done deceptively. No one says, please brainwash me. I want to be brainwashed. I want you to take over my thought processes, and I want to be wholly dependent upon you to think for me, which is the ultimate goal of thought reform. So, thought reform is inherently deceptive. No one really understands that that is what they're participating in. And there is no critique, there is no dialogue, there is no exchange of ideas. There is just thought reform, which is you must submit and you must subordinate your thoughts, your feelings to the prescribed thinking and feeling that we tell you you must adopt to be in this group or to be in this relationship. And so that becomes a much different form of persuasion than advertising, indoctrination, propaganda, or education. So oftentimes people will confuse these categories of persuasion and they'll say, oh, yeah, brainwashing. That's like what happened to me in college. No, it's not. And you need to make those distinctions. And I think Singer did a good job of that. She also wrote a rather compelling piece about what is the difference between the Marine Corps and a cult. And because many people would say, well, in Marine Corps basic training, aren't they using thought reform? And Singer might agree. She might say, well, yeah, I guess, I mean, but it isn't deceptive. I mean, yes, they're using coercive persuasion. They're breaking down the recruit, they're changing the recruit, and then they're locking it in. But they're doing that within the construct of the armed services, which has a code of conduct, uh, a form of military justice. There are ranks, and people are accountable through the structure of the armed forces. Also, Marines are being paid a salary and they have rights and they have benefits, health care, education, et cetera, et cetera. So, what Singer would argue was that when someone signs up to become a Marine, they know what they're getting into, they know it's tough, they know it's going to be very, very difficult to go through basic training and to be a Marine. They also know that the Marines will be the first, wave of the assault, so to speak, and that they will be in the thick of battle more than other branches of the service. And for this reason, the Marines would say, this is why we are so tough, because we need to prepare you for battle. And we can't have people voting on what to do on a battlefield. We have to have a chain of command. We have to have rapid response to orders. And this is the nature of our Marine Corps. And so I think that that's done with informed consent and the understanding of what is entailed and what Marine Corps basic training will be like. And Singer makes those distinctions in a part of her book, Cults in Our Midst.
Yes, yeah. I really appreciate what you're hitting on with the element of deception too. That seems to be core to this work, core to this chart. And so often it seems that what is education in these situations is masquerading as education. It's really thought reform. One example from this chart is the breadth of learning. So in real education, it focuses on learning to learn and learning about reality with the broad goal of rounded knowledge for the development of the individual. Whereas thought reform is inverted. It's an individualized target with a hidden agenda. You will be changed one step at a time to become deployable to serve the leader. Just the stark difference, but easily confused, I think.
Brad, let me flesh this out for you in an intervention I did with a Scientologist. And I have a chapter in my book that recounts this intervention. And it makes the very point that you just reiterated, which is that Scientology uses the name Scientology to imply that it's based on science. But in science and education, it's constantly changing. Theories are disproven. New research changes what we're learning and what the nature of the science that we're learning is based on. And so in Scientology, rather than science, what it really is dogmatic thought reform, being manipulated so that people will rigidly conform to whatever the creator of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, said is true, whether it is or it isn't. And an example I give in the book is that L. Ron Hubbard created a thing called the Purification Rundown. And his claim was that if you did this process, it would purge toxins from the fatty tissues of your body, which would remain there indefinitely if you did not go through the purification rundown. So in Narcanon, which is a Scientology-based drug rehabilitation program, they do the purification rundown, which is you go through saunas, you sweat, you ingest large doses of niacin, and you learn the principles of L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology. And so all of this is done supposedly to purge residues from, let's say, cocaine, marijuana, LSD, or heroin from your body. But what science has proven is that you don't need the purification rundown, that your body dispels drugs in and of itself. And we know this because drug tests will eventually show no drug in the body, and it's not lodged in the fatty tissue. It's gone. And so the premise of the purification rundown is pseudoscientific. It's not real. It's not solid. So when I was working with this husband and father who was thinking of leaving his family to become a full-time member of Scientology in its staff organization, which is called the Sea Org, I said to him, this is not real. And I showed him documentation to demonstrate this. And I said, science is always evolving, but Scientology is not about science. It's about thought reform. And the proof of it is you can't question this theory that Hubbard had. Now, it may have seemed like a good theory in the 1950s when Hubbard was creating Scientology, but it's been disproven by science. And so, does Scientology change as science would change to address the fact that a theory has been proven false? No. L. Ron Hubbard must be right all the time, 100%, period, full stop. Hubbard is never wrong. And this is the same way in virtually every cult that I deal with. The leader is always right, and if you question the leader, you are wrong. And this is the same thing that you deal with in an abusive, controlling relationship. Ask yourself, how does my husband, how does my spouse handle it when I question whether what he believes or says is wrong? If I say, I'm sorry, but, honey, you're wrong about that. How does that work? Does the person say, well, thank you for giving me your input, and why do you think I'm wrong? Well, I think you're wrong because of this, this, and this, and this. Oh, okay, well, maybe I am wrong, and we should talk about this more, and maybe I will adjust and change because you've helped me by giving me constructive criticism. That's not the way a narcissist rolls in an abusive, controlling relationship. And it's also not the way a cult operates. So when you come up against that wall, and no matter what, no matter how obvious it is that the theory is wrong, that the leader is wrong, that the abusive, controlling partner is wrong, what you get instead is renunciation, rage, threats. That tells you that something is terribly wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, and this gets at something that I think the theories that you've cited point out is that change will only occur if it's to further enhance the thought reform. Like I've seen one of these guys at work, and he pivoted through many different philosophies that he was using to educate, but really to do thought reform, until he got very closely connected, basically control over the originator of that school of thought. And then that he said, now I own this method. This is our method, and this is how we are going to work. And that was when he settled. He'd been changing just to find one that gave him more leverage and almost like a connection to a higher power. He now had control over the originator of this philosophy, and that was his method for change.
Well, that is that you've also described Marshall Applewhite, who
Okay.
was the leader of Heaven's Gate. This is a very small, obscure cult that they all died. There were 39 of them, including Applewhite, who died near San Diego. I think it was 1995. And Applewhite told them that they should all ingest, uh, you know, uh, a barbiturate mixed with vodka. And they did this, and then they were suffocated. Their people were a plastic bag was put over their heads after they went to sleep, and they suffocated. And the last person shot themselves and died from a gunshot wound. And people would say, how could this group do that? I mean, how and why did they do that? And also, Applewhite struggled with his sexuality, and he would check himself in and out of mental institutions at point in his life. And he ultimately resolved this by having himself castrated. And then other members of the group, male members, were also castrated, following his example. And again, people would say, how could people behave in this way? How could they do that to themselves, mutilate their bodies? How could they all die like that with him? And the answer is thought reform. And Heaven's Gate is one of the most extreme examples of a controlled environment that I've ever studied or looked at. So Applewhite had all of his followers in a leased house, and they could not leave the house unless they were accompanied by another member who would be with them to make sure that all was well and that they were not doing anything that would disrupt the thought reform. And Applewhite was called their teacher or their master teacher. And they were his class. And he was supposedly bringing them to an awareness that would elevate them to a level above human. And in fact, when they died, he told them, this isn't really suicide. You're simply shedding your containers to become a higher being. And to me, that was chilling, because what he was really saying is, you as a human being are nothing but a container. That's what he had reduced them to. They were containers. And they had cut themselves off from their families, their friends, with rare exception. And this was a completely controlled environment, a totally controlled group, constantly monitored. And he literally controlled them to death. And this is the worst result of thought reform, is when people become nothing. They simply are containers for the leader's ideas, the leader's will, and they no longer function independently or autonomously. I
Mhm.
mean, this is the chilling final result of extreme examples of thought reform.
Mhm. And to see if I understand, tying Applewhite back to the gentleman I mentioned earlier, so Applewhite, sort of the conduit to God, you have to go with Applewhite to be with God, just
He
as
he
the man I
was
mentioned, he controls the method.
he was the Applewhite was fascinated with Star Trek,
Ah,
and he would say that Jesus was actually an away team from a spaceship, and that he was, in fact, Jesus in a previous life, and that Jesus had failed the first time around, and he was killed by what Applewhite would call the Luciferians, and that now he was here to bring as many as possible to the level above human, to realize that they could change and evolve to a higher level, and that this was his mission. And so it was part Christianity, part sci-fi, but all thought reform. And this is what I would say to people, is that you will deal with a group that it may seem like it's martial arts, meditation, a diet program, a multi-level marketing business. It might be political. They claim to be political or environmental or based on some scientific principle. But in reality, look beyond the facade, look beyond the mask that the leader wears, and ask yourself, is this thought reform? Is this a destructive cult? Does it have the three core characteristics? Does it reflect the eight criteria that Lifton lists for thought reform? Does it break people down, change them, and lock them in according to Schein's construct of coercive persuasion? Because regardless of how they present, that's simply the outer shell. That's the mask. What you want to look at is not what they say, but how they behave.
Mhm.
Not what they claim to believe, but their actual group dynamics, the actual impact of what they do. So it's not about what a group believes, it's about their behavior. And groups will present themselves in a way to be appealing, sensational. The leader will grab things from the popular culture, like Applewhite grabs a bit of Star Trek and whatever, and they create this facade, this mask that entices people, becomes a lure, but that's not really what they're bringing you into. What they're bringing you into is a thought reform environment.
So, Rick, I think what we're talking about here, we're starting to touch on the history of the leader, and as we're kind of rounding out these four elements, the history of the leader would be another one that you'd bring up in an intervention. How does that go?
Okay, so there are four blocks to an intervention. First block is defining a destructive cult or defining an abusive controlling relationship. Number two, what is thought reform? What is coercive persuasion? Number three is what do you not know about the group or your partner or the leader that you should know to make an informed choice about your continuing with that partner or that group? Because many times there is a lot of information about a particular group or a leader that is negative. People that have been hurt, lawsuits, criminal convictions, prosecutions, various allegations that all should be looked at to make a more informed choice. So at one point in the intervention, all of my research regarding a particular group or leader will come out, and I will review it with the person I'm working with. And the family will also talk about what they've discovered, what they've found. And that becomes a focus of the discussion. And then the fourth block in an intervention is, why did your family decide to do an intervention? What was it that they witnessed in your behavior and changes in your life that they felt were so alarming that they decided to do an intervention? And I've done at least three interventions that I can recall where someone was in a group, and as a direct result of being in that group, they were not taking medication. Uh, and in specific, I'm talking about insulin. So there were three different interventions that I've done where someone needed insulin to live, and they were not taking the prescribed dosage because the group told them that some supernatural meditation technique, exotic diet could cure their diabetes and they didn't need to take so much insulin. One man that I worked with almost died twice before the intervention, and he was in a group called Falun Gong. People may be familiar with a dance company called Shen, which you see prolific advertising online. Well, that is the creation of Falun Gong, which is led by a man by the name of Lee, Master Lee. who is an exile from China and who now lives in New York State, in near a town called Deer Park in New York, where he has a very large compound called Dragon Springs. And if you look online, Falun Gong diabetes, you will see that the group claims that they can cure diabetes through meditation. So this man that I worked with, he believed that his diabetes could be affected by the meditation and spiritual exercises of Falun Gong. And he almost died twice. He was in his 30s. He had a young wife. He had a little girl that was, I think, at the time of the intervention, uh, no more than 2. And so he had his whole life ahead of him. But he was almost dead because of his involvement in the group. So when his family was sitting there with him, his brother, his father, his mother, they said, please, would you understand and why we're so concerned about you? This is life or death. We're concerned because if you continue like this, you're going to die. And you have a wife and child, and we love you. So the family may uh, express this at that point in the intervention. They will say, "You're on the verge of losing your job because of this group. You're going to flunk out of school because you're not paying attention to your studies because of this group. Your wife is going to divorce you. You're going to lose your family because of this group. Your wife, your husband doesn't want to be with the group, and you're going to go through a divorce. You're going to go through a child custody battle because your spouse is going to try to protect the children from this group and its influence. So we, your family, are here because of these things. This is why we're here. One young woman I worked with in an intervention uh, was subject to severe convulsions, and she took a medication to keep her from going into these severe convulsions that could result in her death. And she was not taking them because the group didn't want her to. It decreased her ability to function for the group. She wasn't as high energy.
Yeah.
She couldn't work as long or whatever. What they didn't care about was that she could go into a convulsion that could end in her death. But her family cared deeply about that. The man that I worked with that was going to go into Sea Org in Scientology was going to divorce his wife, move into Scientology housing, and he would be cut off in large part from spending time with his family. And his children begged him. They said, Dad, we love you. We don't want you to go into Scientology in that way. I mean, we've taken courses that you suggested. We've kind of accepted that you're in Scientology. We're not quite enthusiastic about it like you are, but we can't handle you becoming a Sea Org member because of how it's going to affect our family. And that's why we're here. Because this man had been in Scientology for 27 years. And his family had never staged an intervention until they felt that his entire family life was being threatened by them not doing an intervention. And so at one point in the intervention, the family, the people that have retained me, that we're all sitting together in the room, they're going to talk about what they feel is the reason for this intervention, why they became concerned.
Well, Rick Ross, before I ask my last question, where should people look for you online?
You can find the Cult Education Institute online at culteducation.com. There's also a site, abusivecontrollingrelationships.com, in which you can find a wealth of information, much of what I've talked about. And also, I'm on Twitter now, X, under Rick Allen Ross. You can follow me there. And the Cult Education Institute has a Facebook page and a YouTube channel. So you can see educational videos, follow breaking stories about cults through the Facebook page or the X Twitter account.
We'll put links to that in the description for people to check out. And Rick, my final question is that while your topic is dark, it seems that you've helped so many people. What has this whole experience been like for you as a cult deprogrammer?
As a cult deprogrammer, and also I act as a court expert witness. I've been qualified in 13 states, including United States federal court. And what it's got me is death threats. I've been under surveillance. One group, NXIVM, hired a private investigator to go through my garbage, to have me under surveillance. Another group uh, actually was found out to have hired a hitman to kill a list of perceived enemies. I was on that list. So, and I've been sued 5 times by different groups for information that I shared online through culteducation.com to expose what they were doing. I mean, Keith Raniere, NXIVM, sued me for 14 years in federal court. Shortly before Raniere was arrested, his federal lawsuit against me was dismissed. All of the lawsuits against me filed by cults were dismissed, and none of them went to trial. And the purpose of the lawsuits, in my opinion, was to harass me, to bleed me out financially. And I must say, and I have to thank the many lawyers and law firms that represented me pro bono for free so that I could continue to share information with the public about destructive cults. So it's been an interesting career. There has been some danger in it for me, but at the same time, there's just been an incredible amount of a feeling of helping to get people out of very bad situations that they were in. And I have people staying in touch with me over a period of years and sharing with me that they had a baby, they got married, they bought a new house or whatever. One woman that I worked with, her parents were concerned because in the cult that she was in California, women were sterilized by the suggestion of the leader, the encouragement of the leader, to have a tubal ligation and cauterization. Men had vasectomies. And of course, for women, tubal ligation and cauterization would be very difficult to reverse, virtually impossible. And they would have to do in vitro or whatever to have a child. And the parents staged the intervention with their 26-year-old daughter because they wanted her to have a future and they wanted her to be able to have a family if she wanted. That intervention was successful. And years later, she sent me a picture of her daughter when after her daughter was born. And it's things like that that I think make my work feel worthwhile, despite the threats and the lawsuits and whatnot.
Well, Rick Allen Ross, thank you for the work that you do, for the information that you share, and for taking this time to do this interview with me. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Brad.
To help raise awareness about narcissistic abuse, please share this video. It helps a lot.